Imagine discovering that the person you trusted the most, the person you thought would never betray you, has been hiding a secret for years. And worse, that secret involves someone you've known your entire life. What would you do if you found out your husband had an affair with your best friend in front of everyone you loved? This is a story of heartbreak, betrayal, and the painful journey to reclaim your life. Stay with us as we uncover the twists that changed everything for one woman and the hard lessons she learned along the way. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story that touches the heart and challenges the mind. It was a chilly winter evening in a small suburban neighborhood, the kind of night where the snow falls softly and everything feels a little quieter. Sarah, a woman in her early 40s, stood at the grill in her backyard, tending to the sizzling sausages and burgers for the family BBQ. She felt proud of how things had turned out. Everyone had gathered for this special occasion, a tradition they'd held for years. Her husband, Mark, and their lifelong friend, Laura, were inside helping with preparations. The warmth from the grill contrasted with the cold winter air, but Sarah felt that warmth more deeply as she watched her friends and family mingle, laughing and sharing stories. But something was off. It was subtle at first, just little things Sarah couldn't quite place. Mark was acting distant. He kept glancing at his phone, then quickly slipping it away when anyone came near. Laura, always the life of the party, seemed unusually quiet, her eyes darting over to Mark more often than Sarah had ever noticed before. Sarah shrugged it off at first. Perhaps it was just the holiday stress getting to them. After all, there was nothing out of the ordinary in their relationship, was there? Then, as the evening went on, Sarah started to notice a shift. Mark had always been a little protective of his phone, but tonight he was acting strange, almost paranoid. Every time Sarah approached him, he would quickly turn the screen away, his smile faltering just slightly. That wasn't like him. And what about Laura? Sarah had known her since childhood, shared everything with her. Yet tonight, there was an odd distance between them, like something unspoken hung in the air between them. Had Sarah been blind to it all these years? Had she missed something that was staring her right in the face? She couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at her stomach, the sense that something was amiss, something that wasn't meant to be. As she went inside to grab a drink, Sarah caught Mark and Laura whispering in the corner of the kitchen. They weren't laughing or reminiscing. No, their conversation was serious, their words too quiet for Sarah to hear, but it was the way they were standing so close, too close, that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. Had she walked into something she wasn't supposed to see? Would it all make sense once she confronted them? The nagging feeling wouldn't let her go. And when Mark's phone buzzed again, his quick glance at it followed by the hurried attempt to hide it from her, Sarah knew something was wrong. This wasn't just in her head. Something was happening. But what? And why hadn't she noticed it before? Her hands trembled slightly as she grabbed her drink. She could feel the weight of the moment. It was coming. The truth, the answer to all her questions, was getting closer, and there was no way to turn back now. What would she do when she found out what was really going on? Would she confront Mark and Laura tonight? Or would she bury it all, trying to hold on to the life she had built? The questions hung heavy in the cold night air, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she wondered what would happen next. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The night dragged on, but the unease in her gut only grew stronger. It wasn't just the way Mark and Laura had been acting. It was everything, every glance, every hurried movement, every quiet whisper. She had to know. She couldn't keep pretending it was all in her head. She excused herself from the group and went upstairs to grab her coat. But as she passed by their bedroom, her eyes landed on Mark's jacket, draped carelessly over the back of the chair. His phone was in the pocket, just lying there. Was this a coincidence, or was it a sign? Sarah's heart raced as she stood in the doorway, staring at the phone, trying to decide if she should take the next step. Finally, her curiosity won. She walked over to the chair and carefully reached into his jacket pocket. The phone was warm, like it had just been used. Her breath caught as she unlocked it, her hands shaking just enough to make her pause. She could feel the weight of the decision. What if she found something? What if she didn't? She opened the Messages app, and her eyes immediately landed on the conversation with Laura. The messages were recent, too recent. The words jumped off the screen as though they were shouting at her. "Can't wait to see you again tonight. I miss you more than you know." Another message from Laura read, "We have to be careful. We can't let Sarah find out." Sarah's heart dropped. She couldn't breathe. The words were unmistakable. There was no denying it now. Mark wasn't just distant. He had been having an affair with Laura, her best friend, someone she had trusted for years. It felt like the ground had slipped out from under her. She couldn't wrap her mind around it. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but she couldn't look away. There it was, right in front of her, a betrayal so deep, so shocking, she wasn't sure how to process it. How long had this been going on? How many lies had she been living? The silence in the room felt suffocating as Sarah scrolled down, hoping somehow the messages would explain everything, make it make sense. But there were no explanations, just more secretive plans, more coded language. "Later tonight we're meeting at the usual place," Laura had written just hours before. Sarah's pulse raced as the weight of the truth set in. She wanted to scream, to throw the phone down in frustration, but she couldn't. She had to know more. Had Laura really been hiding this from her for months? Had Mark? Her mind raced with questions, but there was only one thing she could do now: confront them. She stood frozen for a moment, trying to calm her mind, but all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. What would she say to them? How could she look either of them in the eye again? What had happened to the life they had built together? And as she stared at the phone in her hand, Sarah realized something that terrified her even more than the betrayal. She wasn't sure how she was going to handle this. Would she confront them tonight, or wait until she had more answers? The more she thought about it, the more the truth settled in. There was no turning back now. The discovery had been made. The next step was up to her. Sarah's hands trembled as she slowly walked back downstairs, still clutching Mark's phone. She felt numb, as though the weight of the truth had sucked the life out of her. The sounds of the BBQ still echoed from the backyard, but to Sarah it all felt distant, as though she were in another world. The laughter, the casual chatter, none of it mattered now. It all felt hollow. Mark and Laura were standing near the grill, laughing with some of the guests. They looked so comfortable, so normal, like nothing had changed. How could they? How could they stand there and pretend everything was fine when Sarah now knew the truth? She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. It was time. She couldn't keep this to herself any longer. The phone in her hand felt heavier with every step she took. As she reached the door leading to the backyard, she hesitated for just a moment. Should she really do this now? Shouldn't she wait? But then the anger and heartbreak surged inside her, and she knew there was no turning back. With a force she didn't know she had, she pushed the door open. The sudden noise cut through the conversation outside, and everyone turned to look. Mark's face instantly went pale when he saw her holding his phone. Laura's eyes darted nervously between the two of them. "Sarah, what's going on?" Mark asked, trying to mask the tension in his voice with a forced smile. Without saying a word, Sarah stepped forward and held up the phone for him to see. The cold winter air seemed to freeze the moment. Time slowed. Mark's eyes widened in shock, and then something else, fear, Panic flashed across his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You think I didn't know?" Sarah's voice was steady, almost too steady. Her heart was pounding, but she was done pretending. "You think I wouldn't find out? The messages, the lies." Mark took a step toward her, but Sarah held up her hand, stopping him. She wasn't going to let him talk his way out of this, not this time. "You've been with her, haven't you, all this time, right under my nose, and you thought I wouldn't see it." Her words were sharp, each one slicing through the air like a blade. "How long, Mark? How long have you been lying to me?" He opened his mouth again, his eyes desperate. "Sarah, I can explain." "No," she interrupted, shaking her head. "No more excuses. I don't need to hear your explanations anymore." She looked at Laura, who was standing off to the side, her face a mask of guilt. "And you," Sarah said, her voice cold. "I trusted you. You were my best friend. And you—" She stopped herself, feeling the anger bubbling up again. "You've been sneaking around behind my back with my husband. For how long, Laura? How long has this been going on?" Laura's face crumpled in shame, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never wanted to hurt you, I swear," she said, her voice breaking. "It just happened. We never meant for it to go this far. It just happened." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I can't see what's been going on? You've been lying to me for months, both of you, and now you want me to feel sorry for you." Mark's voice finally broke through. "Sarah, please, let's just talk about this. We can fix this." "Fix this?" Sarah repeated, shaking her head in disbelief. "You think you can just fix this? After everything? After what you've done? You can't fix this, Mark. You can't fix betrayal like this." The guests were silent now, the once lively BBQ scene completely still. Sarah's world had turned upside down, and she felt every pair of eyes on her, waiting for what she would do next. The shock on Mark's face was clear. He wasn't prepared for this kind of confrontation. He hadn't expected Sarah to find out, and certainly not like this, in front of everyone. But Sarah didn't care about the audience. She didn't care about anyone else right now. All she cared about was the truth, and it hurt too much to ignore anymore. "Mark," she said, her voice quieter now, but still strong, "you've betrayed me, and Laura, you've destroyed something I thought was unbreakable." She turned to walk away, but something made her stop. "Don't bother trying to explain anymore. This is over." And just like that, it was. Mark stood there, frozen in shock, while Laura looked at Sarah with wide eyes full of regret. But the damage was done. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. Sarah didn't need to say another word. She turned, walked toward the house, and left the chaos behind her. The snow had started falling harder, and the cold seemed to bite deeper as she stepped into the house, away from the betrayal and the lies. The door closed behind her, and Sarah took a moment to breathe. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. But the first step had been taken. The truth had been exposed. And there was no going back now. The silence in the house was deafening. As Sarah closed the door behind her, the weight of everything that had just happened hit her all at once. Her heart felt like it had been ripped out of her chest, but her mind was sharp, focused. There was no time to waste on emotion. Not yet, at least. Not when she still had to figure out what to do next. She stood still for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to steady herself. The sound of the wind outside howling through the trees seemed to echo in her mind. But it wasn't the cold night air that was freezing her. No, it was the realization that her life had just shifted in a way she couldn't control. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being able to handle anything that came her way. But this was different. Sarah made her way into the living room, her steps heavy, like the weight of the situation was pulling her down. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt foreign to her. The familiar couch, the warm lighting, it all felt distant, like she was a visitor in her own home. But she had no time for self-pity, not when Mark was still out there, still trying to figure out how to get back into her life. The minutes ticked by. The storm outside intensified, a perfect match for the storm raging inside Sarah. What was she supposed to do now? She couldn't just pretend this hadn't happened. Her mind raced, each thought a new question. Was this the end of her marriage? Could she ever look Mark in the eye again? Could she forgive him? Could she forgive Laura? And what about the people outside? Her guests, her family, the ones who had witnessed the confrontation. What would they think of her now? She had stood up for herself, sure, but the humiliation was still there. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had just lost everything: trust, love, friendship. But then, as she sat there, trying to piece together the broken fragments of her thoughts, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Laura. "Sarah, please, we need to talk. I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." The words were familiar, almost rehearsed. Apologies, guilt. But something about them didn't sit right. Did Laura really mean it? Or was this just another attempt to cover up the mess they'd both created? Sarah stared at the screen for a moment, her finger hovering over the delete button. She didn't want to hear from Laura. Not right now. Not after everything she'd done. But she couldn't stop herself. Her finger swiped across the screen, opening the message. "I can't believe this," Sarah typed back. "How long, Laura? How long were you lying to me?" There was a long pause before Laura's reply came. "I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. Please just give me a chance to explain." Sarah's mind screamed at her to stop, to just block Laura's number and walk away from it all. But her heart wanted to know. What could Laura possibly say now that would make any of this okay? She stood up, pacing the room, her mind a whirlwind. As she thought about what to do next, her phone buzzed again. This time it was Mark. "I'm sorry, Sarah," his message read. "Please don't make any decisions tonight. Let's talk tomorrow. We can fix this." Fix this. That was the phrase that stung the most. How did he think this could be fixed? How could anything go back to normal after everything that had happened? Her phone buzzed again, and Sarah stared at it in disbelief. It was a voicemail from Mark. Her heart skipped a beat. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She pressed play, her breath caught in her throat as she listened to his voice. "Sarah," Mark's voice sounded strained, almost panicked. "I know I've messed up. I don't know how to make this right, but please don't leave me. I love you. I swear I didn't mean for this to happen. Please, let's just talk. We need to fix this together." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. His words weren't enough. They couldn't be. How could she ever believe him again? The love they'd once shared felt like a distant memory, a dream she could no longer hold on to. She pressed the end button, cutting him off. There was nothing more to say, no more words that could fix what had been broken. She couldn't forgive him, not yet, not when everything still felt so raw. The reality of it hit her like a slap. Mark had betrayed her, and so had Laura. The world she thought she knew was crumbling, and the woman she had been, trusting, hopeful, patient, was now a stranger to herself. But one thing was clear: she wasn't going to let them control her. She wasn't going to let this destroy her. With shaking hands, Sarah stood up, walked to the window, and stared out into the dark night. The snow had stopped falling, but the chill still lingered in the air. It was a coldness she knew she would have to face, both outside and within. Tomorrow would come, and when it did, Sarah would have to make a choice. But tonight, she needed to find some peace. She couldn't fix everything in one night. but she could begin to take control of her life again, and that was a step in the right direction. Tomorrow would be the real test. The night passed slowly, each minute dragging as Sarah lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't escape the images of Mark and Laura together, the betrayal so vivid in her mind. Every moment of their marriage now felt tainted, like a lie she had lived in for years. The pain wasn't just from the affair, it was the crushing realization that everything she thought she knew about her life, her family, her friends, was a lie. But as the first light of dawn broke through the blinds, Sarah knew she couldn't stay in this limbo forever. She couldn't spend another day staring at the same walls, unable to move forward. It was time to face the consequences of the confrontation. She had to make some decisions, whether she was ready or not. The phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen. Mark. He was persistent, at least. "Sarah," the message read. "Please, we need to talk. I'm sorry for everything. Can we meet? I need to explain." The words seemed hollow. He'd said it all before. There was nothing new here, nothing that could undo what had happened. Sarah closed her eyes, her head spinning. Could she even bring herself to look him in the eyes again? Another message popped up. This time it was from Laura. "I know you hate me right now, but please, I'm begging you. Let's talk. I never meant to hurt you. Please don't walk away from me too." Sarah stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She could feel the tears threatening to come again, but she didn't let them. She wasn't going to let either of them manipulate her emotions. Not this time. She put the phone down and got out of bed. The cold air from outside seeped through the cracks in the window, but she didn't mind. She needed to feel that chill against her skin. She needed to wake up from this nightmare. She wandered downstairs to the kitchen, the house eerily quiet, almost too quiet. No more laughter, no more familiar sounds, just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant wind howling outside. As Sarah stood by the counter sipping her coffee, she felt an overwhelming need to get away, to clear her head. The chaos of the past 24 hours had left her in a fog, and the only way she could think to breathe again was to step outside of it for a moment, to leave everything behind, if only for a little while. She grabbed her jacket and headed out the door, stepping into the cold morning air. The street was empty, the houses around her quiet, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Sarah walked aimlessly, her thoughts racing with everything that had happened. She needed answers, but more than that, she needed time. After an hour, she returned home. Mark had texted again, but this time she didn't even bother to look at it. She had to make a choice, and she couldn't do it while he was constantly pressing her for answers. She needed space. As Sarah stepped into the living room, she saw the remnants of the BBQ, the leftover food, the scattered plates. It felt so foreign now, as though it belonged to someone else. The smell of grilled meat lingered in the air, but it was no comfort. It only reminded her of the lies, of the betrayal. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from her mother. Sarah stared at the screen for a moment before answering. She needed someone who understood, someone who wouldn't judge her, someone who would listen. "Hey, Mom," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Oh, honey." Her mother's voice was soft, filled with concern. "How are you holding up?" Sarah closed her eyes, the weight of her emotions threatening to break free. "I don't know, Mom. I really don't know." Her voice cracked. "Everything is just falling apart. I don't know how to deal with it. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine what you're going through right now. But listen to me. You don't have to make any decisions right away. Take some time. Think about what you want, not what they want. And when you're ready, we'll figure this out together." Her mother's words, so simple yet full of love, gave Sarah a little comfort. She wasn't alone. She didn't have to face this by herself. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least she knew she had people who cared. "Thanks, Mom," Sarah whispered. I don't know what to do next." "I know, sweetheart. Take it one step at a time. We'll be here." As Sarah hung up, she felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. The decision wasn't hers to make in a rush. She didn't have to have all the answers today. She could take her time, but that didn't mean she wasn't going to act. She had already taken the first step. She had stood up for herself, exposed the truth. Now, it was time to decide what kind of life she wanted moving forward. She didn't have to let Mark or Laura define it. She could still reclaim control. The morning passed, and with it came a strange sense of clarity. Sarah knew it was time to meet with Mark. It wasn't for answers or apologies. It was to reclaim the power she had nearly lost, to show him that no matter what happened, she wouldn't be his doormat. Not anymore. And when the time came, she would make him face the consequences of his actions. No more running away, no more lies. The fallout was far from over, but Sarah was ready to face it head-on. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the storm inside her was far from over. She had spent the last few hours pacing, sorting through her emotions, and she knew what she had to do. The decision had been made. She was going to meet Mark. Not because she was ready to forgive him, but because she needed to hear him say the words. She needed him to face the consequences of his actions. No more running away. Sarah stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her coat and running a hand through her hair. She looked tired, exhausted really. But there was something else there now, something she hadn't felt in a long time: determination. Whatever happened, she wasn't going to back down. Not this time. As she stepped outside and headed toward the car, her mind was already racing. How was she supposed to feel when she saw him? Anger, relief, or maybe just emptiness? The question lingered as she drove, but there was one thing she knew for certain. She was done being the victim in this story. She was done letting Mark and Laura control the narrative. The cafe was small and quiet, the kind of place that would have once been a peaceful retreat for Sarah and Mark to sit and talk. Now it felt like a place of confrontation. She arrived early, as if the time alone could give her some peace before the storm. She sat at a table near the window, her fingers nervously tapping the surface. The waiting seemed endless. She couldn't help but imagine what it would be like when Mark walked in. What would he say? Would he apologize again? Would it be enough? It was 10 minutes before the scheduled meeting time when Mark finally walked through the door. His eyes immediately scanned the room, landing on her. For a moment, neither of them moved. He looked different, smaller somehow. The confident man she had once known seemed to be replaced by a man full of guilt and shame. He walked toward her slowly, like he wasn't sure if she would even let him sit. When he reached the table, Sarah looked up, meeting his gaze. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. "Sit down, Mark," she said, her voice cold but steady. "Let's get this over with." He nodded and sat down across from her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, almost unbearable. Sarah could see the regret in his eyes, but it didn't matter. Nothing he said could take away what he had done. She didn't need his regret. She needed the truth. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, I don't know where to start. I never meant for any of this to happen. I love you. I always have." Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't feel the need to respond. She just stared at him, waiting. He needed to explain, not excuse. "Laura and I," Mark continued, his voice faltering, "it wasn't supposed to be like this. It was a mistake, a huge mistake. But it's over now. Please just—" "Stop," Sarah cut him off, her tone sharp. Don't sit here and tell me that it was a mistake. You think that's going to make me feel better? You think I'm just going to forgive you because you've decided it's over? I don't care about your excuses, Mark. I care about the truth." His eyes widened, but he didn't respond right away. He was struggling, she could tell, but that didn't matter either. She wasn't here to let him off easy. She wasn't here to make him feel better. She was here to finally take control of her own life again. "Tell me everything," Sarah demanded. "How long? How many times did you lie to me? How many secrets did you keep?" Mark hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. He ran a hand through his hair, a sign of how desperately he wanted to escape the confrontation, but there was no escaping it now. "It started months ago," he admitted quietly. "It wasn't supposed to be anything serious, just a flirtation. But then it became more, and I couldn't stop it." "So you just thought I wouldn't notice?" Sarah's voice was cutting. "That I wouldn't see the signs? All this time I thought we were fine. I thought we had something real, and you've been lying to me, betraying me all this time." "I didn't want to hurt you," Mark said, his voice desperate. "I didn't know how to stop it. I was ashamed. I couldn't face you." Sarah leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "And Laura? What about her? Was she ashamed? Did she feel bad about what she was doing to me? Or did she just play the part of the perfect friend while she destroyed my marriage?" Mark's face reddened, and for a moment it looked like he might break down, but he held it together. "She never meant for this to happen either. She was confused, we both were. But I'm telling you now, it's over. There's nothing left between us." Sarah stared at him, trying to make sense of it all. His words didn't carry weight anymore. They were just more lies, more attempts to make himself feel better. But nothing could undo the damage he'd done. Nothing could erase the betrayal she felt. "I don't know what you want from me, Mark," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady but firm. "I can't just forgive you because you've decided it's over. You don't get to make that choice. I do." The silence in the room stretched for a few more moments, neither of them sure how to move forward. Finally, Sarah stood up, pushing her chair back. "This is done," she said, her voice final. "We're done. I can't pretend this didn't happen. I can't go back to the way things were. I won't." Mark stood up too, but he didn't try to stop her. He knew better than that. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice cracking. "I truly am." Sarah didn't respond. She simply turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving the past, and him, behind her. The air felt colder than before, but this time Sarah didn't mind. She was free. The days following the meeting with Mark were like a blur, a mix of relief and disbelief. Sarah had done what she needed to do, taken control, faced the truth, and finally put an end to the nightmare. But even as she moved through her days, she couldn't escape the heavy weight in her chest. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal anymore. It was the realization that everything she had built with Mark, with Laura, was now shattered. The life she had worked so hard to create felt like a dream, one that had slipped through her fingers. But Sarah wasn't the type to wallow. She had never been. And even though the past week had been hell, she knew she couldn't let it define her. The first few days had been hard, harder than she expected. She didn't want to leave the house. She didn't want to talk to anyone. But slowly, things started to shift. Slowly, she began to pick up the pieces of her life. She spent more time with her friends, those who hadn't turned their backs on her anyway. It was strange, the way some people reacted. Some offered sympathy, others distanced themselves. But the ones who stayed, they were the ones who truly mattered. They were the ones who reminded her of who she was outside of her relationship with Mark. One evening, her best friend Michelle invited her over for dinner. It was a small gathering, just the two of them, a bottle of wine and some takeout. It was exactly what Sarah needed. They ate, they talked, and for the first time in days, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. "I know you're angry," Michelle said as they sat together on the couch, sipping wine. "But you don't have to do this alone. We've got your back." Sarah smiled, grateful for the support. "I know. It's hard. I thought I knew him. I thought I knew who he was." "You did. But people change, and sometimes it's not for the better. But you can change too. You're stronger than you think, Sarah. Don't let him take that away from you." The words stuck with her. Michelle was right. Mark had changed. But Sarah didn't have to follow him down that path. She could rebuild herself. She could find her way back. The next few days, Sarah focused on herself. She started taking walks again, something she hadn't done in months. The fresh air, the quiet of the neighborhood, it gave her clarity. She began reading again, something that had fallen by the wayside when her life revolved around Mark and his needs. She found herself starting to laugh again, even if it was just at something silly on TV. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, moments where she thought about calling Mark, wondering if he had really changed. But those thoughts were fleeting. Sarah had learned that some things couldn't be fixed, no matter how much you wanted them to be. She couldn't change the past, but she could change her future. One evening, as Sarah was going through some old photos of her and Mark, she stumbled across a picture of her and Laura from years ago. It was at a family gathering, back when things were simple, before everything got complicated. She stared at it for a long moment, the memory of their friendship a painful reminder of how deeply she had been hurt. But something shifted in her mind. She didn't have to hold on to that pain. She didn't have to let it consume her. She could let it go. For the first time since the betrayal, Sarah felt a sense of peace. It wasn't complete, but it was a start. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't afraid of it anymore. She had learned to stand on her own 2 feet again, and that strength would carry her through whatever came next. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah found herself thinking less and less about Mark and Laura. She started making plans for herself, things she had put off for years. There was a life waiting for her, and she was finally ready to live it. One evening, just as Sarah was winding down her day, her phone rang. It was an unknown number, and for a moment she debated whether to answer. But curiosity got the best of her, and she picked up. "Hello?" she said cautiously. "Sarah?" a familiar voice said on the other end. It was Laura. For a moment, Sarah felt her heart stop. She had no idea what Laura wanted now, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't ready for this. "What do you want, Laura?" she asked, her voice steady but cold. I don't know where to begin," Laura said, her voice sounding small, almost as if she were unsure of herself for the first time. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, and I want to apologize. I never meant to hurt you. I was wrong." Sarah didn't speak for a moment. She wasn't sure what to say. She hadn't spoken to Laura since the BBQ, and the anger that had once burned brightly inside her had faded into something else. Disappointment, sadness, and a deep sense of betrayal. "Why are you calling me now?" Sarah finally asked. "You've had months to apologize. Why now?" "I know," Laura said, her voice breaking. "I've been selfish. I've been avoiding the truth. But I can't keep living like this. I'm sorry, Sarah, for everything." Sarah leaned back in her chair, staring at the phone, trying to process the words she was hearing. Could she believe Laura? Could she even trust her? "I don't know if I can forgive you," Sarah said slowly, her voice quieter now. "What you did, it wasn't just a mistake. You betrayed me, and I don't think I'll ever be able to look at you the same way again." "I understand," Laura replied. "I just wanted you to know how sorry I am. You were always like family to me. I've lost everything now, and I don't want to lose you too." The sincerity in Laura's voice caught Sarah off guard. She didn't know if it was enough, but it was something, and that for now was all she could handle. "Take care of yourself, Laura," Sarah said softly before ending the call. She sat there for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling in. It wasn't closure, but it was a start. And for Sarah, that was enough for now. She didn't need Laura's forgiveness to heal, but she realized that letting go of the anger might be the final step toward moving on. The past was behind her. The future was hers to create, and Sarah was ready. The weeks turned into months, and Sarah began to find herself again. The initial pain of betrayal slowly transformed into something else, something almost unrecognizable. She no longer felt defined by the affair or the fallout. The life she had once known was gone, but in its place, Sarah was building something new. A life where she wasn't weighed down by the past. She had kept a low profile, spending time with those who truly cared about her. She reconnected with old friends, the ones who hadn't vanished when the storm hit. They reminded her of the person she was before everything fell apart, strong, independent, and capable of standing on her own. One afternoon, while sipping coffee with Michelle at a small cafe, Sarah realized just how much had changed. She was laughing, genuinely enjoying herself. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like the world was closing in on her. "You know," Michelle said, taking a sip of her drink, "you've really come a long way. I can see it. You're starting to get back to yourself." Sarah smiled softly. "I don't know if I'll ever be the same, but I guess that's okay. I'm starting to like who I'm becoming." Michelle raised an eyebrow. "Well, I hope that means you're thinking about dating again. Maybe meeting someone new. You've got so much to offer, Sarah." Sarah hesitated. The idea of opening up to someone else was still daunting. She wasn't sure she was ready for another relationship. Not yet. But the idea of eventually being happy again, with or without someone else, didn't seem as impossible as it had once felt. Maybe someday. For now, though, Sarah was focused on herself. She began exploring things she had long put on hold. She started a painting class, something she'd always wanted to try. She took weekend trips by herself, visiting places she'd always wanted to see. It wasn't much, but it was hers. It was her new normal. As she sat back in her chair watching the world outside, Sarah felt a quiet satisfaction. She wasn't whole yet, but she was getting there, one day at a time. It had been 6 months since Sarah last saw Mark. 6 months since that final conversation at the cafe. She had buried the past, or so she thought, locked away in a box that she wasn't sure she ever wanted to open again. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon during a routine grocery trip. Sarah had just picked up a few things when she turned the corner in the store aisle and froze. Standing in front of her, with a cart full of groceries, was Mark. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them seemed to thicken, and all the old emotions flooded back. Anger, hurt, confusion. But there was something else too. Something that Sarah couldn't quite place. It wasn't love. It wasn't even regret. It was just a sense of finality. Mark looked as surprised to see her as she was to see him. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at her, as if trying to figure out what to do next. He looked different, thinner, worn out. The weight of his own actions seemed to be catching up with him, and Sarah couldn't help but notice it. "Sarah," he said softly, breaking the silence. I didn't expect to see you here." Sarah kept her voice calm, though a part of her wanted to shout, "Clearly." For a moment they stood there awkwardly, neither of them sure how to proceed. Sarah had so many questions. Why was he here? What did he want? Was he hoping for a reunion, a second chance? But none of that mattered anymore. Sarah had moved on, or at least she was moving forward. Mark was no longer the center of her world. He was just a part of her past, and that's where he was going to stay. "I guess this is where I apologize again," Mark said, his voice low. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. I know I can never fix what I did, but I want you to know that I regret it. I've been a terrible person." Sarah stared at him, feeling a knot form in her stomach. She didn't want his apology. She didn't need it. "You're right," she said firmly. "You can't fix it. What happened is over, Mark. There's nothing left to say." The words were out before she could stop them. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even sad. She was just done. She had moved past it all, and now it was time to leave him behind for good. Mark didn't argue. He just nodded, as though he knew this was the end of their story. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for everything." Sarah gave him a small nod. She didn't need to say anything else. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was just final. She turned to leave, her steps sure and steady. As she walked away, Sarah felt something shift within her. It wasn't relief. It wasn't closure. It was simply peace. The last piece of her past was finally behind her. She didn't look back. When she got to the parking lot, Sarah took a deep breath, looking up at the sky. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the horizon. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. Whatever came next, she knew she was ready. She was done with the past. The future was hers to write.